The subject of this fourth lecture is virtue, and it's subdivided into four parts. First of all, we'll talk about man's function and excellence, or virtue. Secondly, about the array of virtues. And third, the distinction between the intellectual and the moral virtues. And finally, on the hierarchy of virtues, how the various virtues are related to one another, ordered among themselves. The question, what is the good for man, is one that we've seen discussed already in terms of man's ultimate end, and the fact that it relates to his nature and what would be fulfilling of it. I want now to say a few words about Aristotle's approach to this issue. I indicated when we were looking at the first article of the first question of the first part of the second part of the Summa, that when Thomas talks about human actions and when he talks about the fact that the good and an ultimate good, ultimate end, is just built into the picture when we're talking about human actions, that this is not the way in which Aristotle came up with the notion of an ultimate end. What was Aristotle's way? Aristotle said that what we have to do is to ask what man's function is, what man's role is. And what he had in mind was this. If you, for example, would say of somebody that they're a good golfer, you would first of all have to know what golfing is, what the function is, what the activity is, and that would have built into it the criteria of doing it well or badly. And insofar as one fulfilled that activity, fulfilled that role, performed that activity well or badly, you would say that they had the excellence of that activity. It's arete, or as that Greek term is translated, virtue. So all we need do on this basis, if we want to know, that is, if we want to know if someone's a good golfer, we have to know, well, what's golfing? If we want to know whether somebody is a good bank teller, we have to know, well, what's that function? What's that role? Once we know that, we'll be able to tell whether you're doing it well or badly. And so it would be with an automobile, with a camera, with someone who is directing a program, and so forth. Once we know what the function is, then we're able to appraise whether it's being done well or badly. Now, before continuing with this, it's important, it's probably inevitable that we allude to what has seemed to be an enormous roadblock to this kind of procedure, and indeed to the procedure that we attributed to Thomas Aquinas in our previous lecture. And this goes back to a question that David Hume raised, and he raised it as a question, that it was a kind of skeptical obstacle that he was throwing across the path of moral philosophy, and it goes something like this. Hume says, I hear people talking a lot in this fashion. They'll say, well, such and such is the case, and so is the case, therefore you ought to do something or other. Hume says, isn't it odd that we're able to deduce or derive a ought from an is? Now, this little question of Hume's has fascinated philosophers ever since. And it took on new life in our own century when, in 1903, G.E. Moore published a little book called Principia Ethica. And in it, Moore described the transition, or the effort to make a transition, from the way things are to the way they ought to be, or from the way things are to the way we ought to be. He called that the naturalistic fallacy. He gave it a fancy name like that. And of course, nobody wants to be guilty of a fallacy. Once that had been established, to Moore's satisfaction, and as I say, it had a great influence, what it came down to was this. You can know to a fairly well all about what a human being is, what a human being does, and that doesn't take you 1 inch closer to knowing what a human being ought to do. You'll never know whether someone, some human being is acting well or badly in terms of knowing what their nature is, for example. It's possible to tell the story of Anglo-American philosophy through the century in terms of a variety of reactions to this reintroduction, so to say, of Hume's guillotine, as it's been called, into 20th century moral philosophy by G.E. Moore. Moore himself became an intuitionist. That is, he thought there were objective, good, moral goods and evils, but he thought you just saw them, and they had nothing to do with the way things are. They're not something you could arrive at knowledge of from a greater and more profound knowledge of yourself or human beings or the things around us. It was just you saw them in the way in which you see yellow. It's just there's no antecedent to it. You just have this kind of moral intuition or this moral sense. And either you have it or you don't, of course. Now, one of the difficulties with that view is that it doesn't help us at all to understand why it is that we argue about moral judgment. I say something's good, you say it's bad. And we tend to think that there are certain things that count on behalf of the one answer or the other, so that the argument goes on in those terms. If Hume is right, or if Hume is right, yeah, but if Moore is right, none of this makes any sense whatsoever, because none of those premises would really be relevant to the conclusion as to the goodness or badness of a particular action. Very strange view, you might think. And when people began to want to take more seriously into account the fact that we do argue on behalf of certain value judgments, as they tend to be called, when they wanted to analyze a moral argument, they tended to kind of put into the background this assumption of G.E. Moore that no factual premises would ever be sufficient for arriving at a value judgment. So it was assumed in terms of the moral reasoning that you have to have already in the premises a evaluative proposition along with, say, descriptive one, and then you would be able, from a combination of a value judgment and a description, you would be able to derive some further value judgment. But that had to be built into it. Now, what happened, just to continue this sketch of the 20th century moral philosophy, among the philosophical theories that was advanced was that, of course, we have these arguments, and we might disagree about the facts of the situation in which we act, but when you come right down to the values, to the goods and the evils that we assert, there is simply nothing in the objective situation that we're talking about which they name. So the question is, what does good mean? If I see someone applying a Louisville slugger to the head of a little old lady, and I say that's bad, and you say no, that's okay, nice backswing and so forth. Here we're disagreeing about what's going on, not what's happening. We both would describe the situation, let's say, in identical ways, but I disapprove of it, and you approve of it. What emerged from this was a view, it was one view among others at first, that to say of something that it's good or bad is to express your emotions, your feelings, your subjective attitude towards it, and not to name anything further in the objective situation that you're talking about. Emotivism, as this was called. And as Alistair McIntyre has suggested, we are all emotivists now. McIntyre sees our situation as one of universal emotivism, so that people are very likely to say, when they disagree with someone else morally, or when somebody makes a moral judgment they don't like, that it's an expression of the feelings or the subjectivity of that other person, and it doesn't have any objective claim on them. Now, the trouble with that is that it makes it impossible not only to have moral agreement, but to have moral disagreement. Because then what a moral judgment is something like my saying, or a moral disagreement, apparent one would be, I say I have lower back pain, and you say I don't. Obviously these are two perfectly compatible claims. You're talking about your lack of pain, and I'm talking about my pain, so that we can both say that, and they don't collide. If a moral judgment, if emotivism was true, moral judgments would be of that kind. When I say of a certain kind of action or single action that it is good, I'm just expressing my feeling. And if you say it's bad, you're just expressing your feeling. So as in the pain example, we're not really disagreeing with one another. So moral judgments turn out to be fairly irrational, totally subjective, and relative, a fairly untenable situation. It's interesting in the light of that, to see, when one sees where that has led, it's interesting to know that there was an almost unobserved dismissal of the situation that led to More's invention of the naturalistic fallacy in a little article by Peter Geach, which appeared in a magazine, a philosophical magazine called Analysis, and a little article called On Good and Evil. And what Geach did, in effect, in that article is to bring back into contemporary moral discourse the technique that Aristotle had used in the Nicomachean Ethic. And Geach, in a number of ways, the best little summary of it, since the journal Analysis is not on everyone's shelf, is this little paperback by Bernard Williams, Morality, an Introduction to Ethics, a Harper Torch book. In the chapter on good, he depends upon, relies upon that article of Peter Geach that I mentioned. And what Geach is saying is this: look, it just doesn't make any sense to say that the attribution of good to a thing or to an action has nothing to do with what the thing or action is. That's the kind of adjective that good is. It's not an adjective like yellow at all. So he goes back to this. If you want to know if something is a good watch, you ask, what is a watch for? If this object does what a watch is for, that's the grounds you have for saying it's a good watch. If you would tell, say you're a jeweler, you're trying to sell something, and you say it's a good watch, but it doesn't tell time, it's too heavy to carry around, and other things like that, someone would want to know, what is this Pickwickian sense of good that leads you to call it a good watch? If it doesn't do what a watch does, then there's no point in calling it a good watch. Geach brought back into the arena of moral discourse, and it was probably popularized more by Bernard Williams' adoption of it, this notion of function, the function of a thing as being the grounds for our being able to say whether the function was performed well or badly, and then the one performing that function is called good or bad in terms of whether or not the function is well performed or not. We'll come back then to discuss the variety of virtues that can arise out of this sort of analysis. Well, after having been cast into exterior darkness for a number of decades due to the hegemony of the naturalistic fallacy, thanks to a little article of Peter Geach, there came back into currency in talking about the appraisal of actions or of anything as good or bad, the notion that we have to know what it is, so that the nature of the thing, the nature of the function, is controlling in our ability to say whether or not the function is being performed well or badly, and then consequently whether the one performing that function should be called good or bad. It was a breath of fresh air. And it tended to look, as I described it when I mentioned it a moment ago, it looked like the reinstatement of the Aristotelian analysis. I also mentioned that Bernard Williams took it up in a little book of his and welcomed it and thought it was a great thing, but Bernard Williams said, the problem with it is that, well, you can talk about the function of a person as a father or as a husband or as a cameraman or as a golfer, a bank teller, all these particular functions. Man as such has no function. So that this doesn't really help you to move to an answer to the question that guided the discussion from the beginning: what is the good for man? What makes a human agent good as such? And again, Williams is quite, I think, sincerely disappointed that Geach's reintroduction of this mode of analysis, call it the function analysis, which enables us to tie down the ascription of good to an agent playing this role, that role, or the other role just won't enable us to make the move that Aristotle wanted to make to the function of man as man, and such that we could say what? To perform that function well is to be a good man. So that's the kind of argument it is. If the function of golfing is such and such, then to perform that function well is the basis of our saying that so-and-so is a good golfer. If a human being as such, the human agent as such, has a function, then by parity of reasoning, to perform that function well is the basis for saying this is a good human being. And Bernard Williams says that's the way it's supposed to go, but alas, it's not going to work because there isn't any such thing as a function for the human agent as such. What Aristotle called his ergon, or his work, the specifically human work. Well, isn't there? Clearly, Bernard Williams is committed to the view that if there is such a function, then the well performance of that function is the basis for our saying of a human agent that he's a good one, that he's a good person, a good man, a good human being. Now, how does Aristotle approach this? He started with the function analysis, and he will say things like, does the eye have a function, and does man not have a function? And it's clear what he's saying. We know what an eye is. If we see well with an eye, or if we see well with the eye, we say it's a good eye. That's the arete, or the perfection. The virtue of the eye is to see well, and that leads us to call it a good one. So Aristotle lays that out, and then he wants to move to what is the function of man. And unlike Bernard Williams, he anticipated him by about 2,500 years, he's not put off by the transition, and he's able to put forward an answer to the question, what is man's function? And he arrives at it not unlike the way in which St. Thomas Aquinas made the distinction that we were talking about yesterday between human acts and the acts of a man. Remember that what Thomas said is this, that there are certain operations or activities which are truly ascribable to a human being, but they're not ascribable to him as a human being. That is, they can be found in things other than a human being. So that if you were, let's say, on the third floor and someone passed by your window, let's say from the top to the bottom, plummeting to the street, you would say that so-and-so is falling. This is an activity which, as it happens, you could drop a cow off the roof and it would fall like that. You could drop a bag of cement, a rock, it would fall in the same way. Falling is not among the things that we would think characterizes a human being, and we wouldn't tend to congratulate someone because he fell well, let's say, in most ordinary circumstances. He might be a stunt man in the movies, and we would be congratulating him on his skill in that case. But a fall in the sense of an accidental tumble, we're not going to tell somebody, I like the way you do that. That was pretty neat. So these are not activities that characterize human being. No more, remember those other acts of a man as Thomas called them, to distinguish them from human action, digestive functions, for example, or just feeling emotion, feeling attracted to that which promises pleasure and repelled by that which threatens pain. These are just instincts that we have. They're just things that happen willy-nilly, whether we like it or not. So we're not likely to think of those as characteristic, as being human, or as being characteristic of human beings, because in the higher animals, at least, we tend to see reactions pretty much like those of fear and of desire and the like. So Aristotle keeps pushing this. And I'm trying to link it now to Thomas's distinction between human acts and the acts of a man. Aristotle keeps pushing this and asks, what is the activity that sets a man off from all other agents? And he answers in the same way that Plato had and Socrates had, and indeed, as most of us would, what distinguishes human beings from all other things in this cosmos, in the material universe, is the fact that a human being thinks. A human being engages in rational activity. And the greatest sign of this is the fact that we are the talking animal. We are the talking animal. We communicate to one another by a very supple set of signs, and it's almost hilarious to compare the signals and signs of animals to this extremely malleable tool of human language, which is what? Expressive of our apprehension, of our grasp, our cognitive grasp of the world around us. This sets us off, and so speech is a sign of reason. The speaking animal, rational animal, we could say, that's almost what it meant for the Greeks, the animal who talks. This is what sets us off from all other things in the cosmos. So Aristotle would say that is the distinctive activity of a human being, rational activity. And then, again, by parity of reasoning, what he would presumably go on to say is this: to perform that activity well is the human virtue, or arete, and one who possesses that would be called a good human being. Okay. Now, it's at this point that we can give due consideration to the misgivings of someone like Bernard Williams, that he's not alone in saying, well, wait a minute, rational activity is a phrase that covers everything that a human being does, certainly everything that would count as a human act in Thomas's sense, so that golfing is rational activity, bank telling is rational activity, taking photographs is a rational activity, and we seem to be right back where we were before. And it's impossible for us then to say that there is some overarching sense or some single sense of rational activity which would enable us to use the kind of parity of reasoning approach that I've mentioned several times. Rational activity is distinctive of man. To perform that well, to have the virtue of rational activity, is the basis for saying that this is a good human being. What is the objection? Rational activity isn't some one thing. Now, when this is brought forward as an objection to Aristotle, one is somewhat surprised, because when we read this passage in Aristotle, or this argument, you'll find it in chapter 7 of book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethic. It is Aristotle who immediately tells us that rational activity has a variety of meaning. It is not a single thing, but it has a set of meaning. And we find him laying out the various senses of rational activity, and Thomas follows this very closely in his Summa. Aristotle says, let's distinguish between essential rational activity and participated rational activity. What is participated rational activity? That's rational activity. I move my hand, but you figure that's a hand, that's a limb, that's a part of my body. It shares in reason in the sense that it's directed by reason. Believe it or not, I decided to do that. I'll do it again. I mean, I've got great capacities in that regard. But that would be rational activity in the sort of derivative sense, as opposed to what essential rational activity, that is the activity of the mind as such, thinking. So Aristotle makes, first of all, that very important distinction. The way in which you see someone would be held accountable for deciding to move his hand. At an auction, if you make a certain kind of movement, you're likely to find yourself heavily in debt, or at least explaining to the auctioneer why you don't plan to pay the amount of money that the bid had reached when you scratched your ear or something like that. So that is considered to be something you deliberately did, that you're answerable for, and rational in that sense. But it's clearly not a mental act to move your hand, whereas thinking as such is a mental act. And that's what Aristotle means by essential rational activity. He distinguishes essential rational activity, as we are prepared to see, into two kinds. On the one hand, there is the theoretical use of our mind, and on the other hand, there is the practical use of our mind. Now, if we just kept it there, we have three senses of rational activity: theoretical, the theoretical use of our mind, the practical use of our mind, and let us say commanded rational acts, the movement of our body deliberately and intentionally. Now, what that would mean is what? Well, we don't have a single meaning of rational activity, so there isn't a single virtue. What the upshot of this acknowledgement of the equivocation, or as Thomas would say, the analogous character of rational activity, is that we have a plurality of virtues. We have excellence in theoretical use of our mind, excellence in the practical use of our mind, and excellence in those activities which are subservient to the command of reason, or amenable, perhaps would be better, to the command of reason. So in this sense, we have three senses of virtue which are predicated on three senses of rational activity. So Aristotle, rather than throwing up his hands and saying it looks as if the analysis won't go through, is guided by what he's talking about, and comes up with the notion here of a plurality of virtues, which we will continue to explore in a minute. The great question in ethics is, what is the good for the human agent? What is the purpose of our life? And what we've been looking at in Aristotle is a mode of analysis which is meant to bring us to that question. In virtue of what would we say of a human person that he's a good human person? What makes the human agent to be a good human agent? The function analysis, as we're calling it, that we find in Aristotle, and which was rehabilitated in recent times, is meant to be the device that enables us to answer that question. We saw that the structure of it is rather straightforward. Geach's position is clearly the triumph of common sense over theory, in pointing out that the way in which we appraise a car as a good one is by asking, well, what is an automobile? What's it for? And in the light of that kind of knowledge, we're able to appraise a car as a good one or a bad one. Of course, even that kind of appraisal can be very complicated. If we say so-and-so is a good golfer, that doesn't mean that he performs just one swing well, but he has to have a whole repertoire of swings in his game before we're likely to say he's a good golfer. Sometimes we would qualify it and say, well, he drives well, or he's a good putter, or he has good approach shots, but that's about the sum total, one or the other of those. So that we would say he's good in a sense, but not a good golfer in the sense that he doesn't play the game taken totally well. So that even in these seemingly very simple examples, we would find on analysis that they're complicated enough, so that we're not really startled to find that when we try to apply this analysis, the function analysis, to the human agent as such, that we're going to run into the recognition that it's really a very complicated thing to talk about the function of a human being. But again, it's a complicated thing to talk about the function of a golfer, for that matter, or a Swiss Army knife. So Aristotle is perfectly ready to acknowledge, in fact, he's the one who brings it to our attention, that rational activity, the proposed definitive function of a human being, is ambiguous in the sense that it lends itself to a variety of connected meaning. So it's not purely equivocal, but it is what Thomas would call an analogous term. It has a set of meanings which are related and controlled within that set. So Aristotle, as I was indicating, gives three meanings right away of rational activity: theoretical thinking, practical thinking, and those activities other than thinking which are amenable to the direction of reason. Now, what this comes down to in Aristotle and in Thomas and in many others is a recognition of a distinction between intellectual virtues on the one hand and moral virtues on the other. Moral virtues tend to be, the term virtue in the moral sense tends to be reserved for the excellence of rational activity in the most extended sense of the term. That is, insofar as our appetites come under the influence of reason. So what would be the first way in which one would want to distinguish between intellectual virtues and moral virtues? If we think of the excellences, the perfection, the doing well of theoretical thinking, what we're going to be reminded of are the sciences. Aristotle distinguishes a number of virtues of the theoretical use of our mind, a number of them. And what characterizes them, by and large, is this. Intellectual virtues are acquired by learning. Moral virtues are not. Now notice how this connects with an earlier discussion as to whether or not the study of moral philosophy will make us morally good. What Aristotle insists on at the beginning of the second book of his Nicomachean Ethics is that the great difference between intellectual virtues and moral virtues is that the first intellectual virtues are learned. They are things that we can be taught, whereas moral virtues are not acquired by learning. How are they acquired? Aristotle gives us one of his more quotable phrases. The only way to learn how to play the harp is to play the harp. Moral virtues are acquired by repeated acts of a given kind. That is, we acquire a habit. We acquire a habit. This is why virtues and habits tend to be linked. Virtue is a kind of habit, a good one, as opposed to a bad one. But we, by dint of repeated actions of a certain kind, are inclined so to act in the future. And if we don't acquire good habits, we're going to have bad habits, such that it's going to be very difficult for us not to keep doing the wrong thing. But in either case, it's going to be a matter of habituation, of a far more existential orientation of ourselves than when we learn something. So that what we can say here is that when we're learning, what do? We change our mind from not knowing to knowing, or from agreeing to disagreeing to agreeing, let's say, with a particular claim, because now we see the reason for the claim that is being made. So we change our mind. But when we're talking about the moral virtues, we're talking about changing our lives. We're talking about something that is not simply a matter of seeing something. There's nothing easier for us, perhaps, than to, it's easier for us to understand moral advice than to abide by it. Kierkegaard gives trying to make the same distinction, trying and succeeding, gives the example of a recruit in the army who is talking in ranks, and the sergeant says, "Shut up, don't talk in ranks." And he says, "I understand what you're saying. You mean when we're standing here in a row like this, we shouldn't be talking." And he says, "Shut up." He says, "Yeah, I got you, I understand that." And what Kierkegaard is drawing attention to is this, that there's a kind of understanding that is a misunderstanding. The way to answer a command is not to give an analysis of it or to tell the commander what it was that he was saying, but in this case, in point, simply to shut up. So it is with practical advice, and so it is with the acquisition of the moral virtues. We can understand, let us say, a book of ethics. You and I can read the Nicomachean Ethics, and in some sense can be moved by it, in the way in which we can be moved by acts of heroism, let's say, on the stage or in a movie, but that doesn't make us courageous, does it? So too, we can read the Summa, and we can imagine ourselves acquiring these virtues that are being talked about, but that isn't the way they're acquired, by imagining them or reading about them. There's only one way to do it, and it's a long, difficult way of acquiring them by repeated acts of a certain kind. So there's a great difference between moral virtue and intellectual virtue. But again, let me just underscore this seeming paradox. The moral virtues are what? They are the bringing of the emotions under the control of reason. The two major moral virtues that Aristotle distinguishes, and we'll be coming back to this when we talk about the cardinal virtues, are temperance and fortitude. And what temperance does is to bring our desires, bearing on the pleasurable, under the sway of reason, so that we feel desire, whether we want to or not, but how we act in the presence of that desire is up to us, and that's what we're responsible for. But obviously, if we constantly are giving in to our desires, we're habituated to act in that way, and we're even less likely to be able to make a rational judgment as to what we ought to do prevail over our emotion. But generally, that's what Aristotle means by a moral virtue, to humanize the emotions. Not to be controlled by them, but to integrate them into our lives in such a way that they serve the overall good, the ultimate end of the human agent. But that paradox, that this is the perfection of rational activity in only an extended sense of the term, that is, participated rational activity, whereas the perfection or excellences of rational activity in the essential sense of the term are virtues only in a secondary sense. Why is that? Well, it has a lot to do with the way in which we define virtue. Take Aristotle's definition of virtue. Virtue is that which makes the one having it good and renders his activity or operation good. That just summarizes, doesn't it, the function analysis that we've been talking about. But what you'll notice about that definition is the recurrence of the term good. And good is the object of appetite, of desire, of our impetus towards things, whereas the true is the object of intellection, of cognition. Cognition has achieved its term by and large if it arrives at the truth of the matter. Whereas appetite is drawn towards things as they are in themselves. So insofar as good enters into the definition of virtue in the way in which it does, appetite is going to be the seat of the virtue in the primary sense of the term. And in the case of the intellectual virtue, we have the capacity, as Thomas says, to act well, but we don't have the inclination to use that capacity well simply by dint of having it. I may know geometry well, but I don't, just by dint of having that skill, that intellectual skill, I don't have the disposition to use it well. One of the bitter truths is that we can become highly adept at knowledge of the natural world and at technology and so forth, and we worry about that kind of possession of technical knowledge, maybe not in ourselves, but at least in others, because of how easily it can be put to a bad use. So the skill itself, or the intellectual virtue itself, does not dispose us to act well, whereas the moral virtue, since it has its seat in appetite and in our orientation towards the good, is by definition a disposition to act well. But anyway, what we have here now is, on the basis of the plurality of meanings of rational activity, we have a plurality of virtues. And what we now have to ask ourselves is, do we just have a lot of virtues, or are they related to one another in terms of some kind of hierarchy? And despite what I've just said, it's going to turn out that on one hierarchy of the virtues, the intellectual virtues, which are less virtues than the moral virtues, come out on the highest rank. But we'll be talking about that in a moment. The great question of ethics is, what is the good for such an agent as ourselves? And to say that it's virtue might seem simply a kind of pious remark at first, but of course now we, having followed this analysis, this function analysis, as we're calling it, that we find in Aristotle, and we see how it complements, though it's not identical, with the distinction that Thomas made between human acts and the acts of man, we're able to see that virtue is simply performing well a certain function. It's the excellence of the function, or the arete. So it follows as night the day that the acquisition of virtue is the acquisition of the capacity to perform good acts, and it is that then in virtue of which thanks to which we are going to be called good. But there are many of them. There are many of them, and that raises a question: how many of them do we have to have in order to be a good person? Or is it sufficient just to have one and say, well, I'm good because I have this virtue. It's the perfection of rational activity. Rational activity is the characteristic activity of a human being, ergo, etc. I'm a nice guy. Huh? Well, as we know, that isn't going to be sufficient. And particularly, as in the case that I was hinting at a moment ago, where we think of someone who has a great deal of knowledge, that knowledge can be put to a very sometimes damaging purpose by such a one. Just imagine if we found that a scientist comes out of his laboratory, face aglow, hair all mussed up and so forth, and with burning gaze tells us, I've found a cure for cancer. Well, we're delighted. And we're sure he's going to get the Nobel Prize and so on. And we go into his lab with him and to get further information about this great discovery, and we hear kind of snuffling and snarling and edgy action around us, and we realize that the lab is filled with cages. And we look in them, and there are people in them. Huh? And we realize that this man has been using human subjects as lab animals. And now we begin to alter our view about this fellow. We were so proud of him and congratulating him and so forth, and now we're really appalled by what he has done. So the question then arises is he less of a scientist for having degraded human beings in the way in which he has, or is this some defect beyond scientific knowledge as such? A complicated subject, but it is possible for us to say that somebody could be a good geometer and a bad man. Somebody could be a good scientist and a bad man. So that the virtues, thanks to which one is a good scientist, and by that, what do we mean? Excellence in the use of his mind as bearing upon certain objects of pursuit or inquiry. That's what we mean by an intellectual virtue. So anyone who is a scientist, who has a habit of knowledge in a particular area, geometry, microbiology, whatever, astronomy, would have an intellectual virtue. And yet, what the example, the somewhat far-fetched example, let's hope, that I've just put before you would indicate is that that virtue is compatible with bad choices, bad decisions, bad moral action. So what we begin to discern is this, that unless these intellectual virtues are part of a good life, that is, unless they are not only skills acquired but are directed to the overall good of the human being, which again we realize is not just the good of that individual as an individual, then this is an immoral use of the knowledge. But this needn't lead us to deny that the person has the knowledge and has the intellectual virtue. So some virtues clearly are not anywhere near sufficient for us saying of someone that he is a good man. There we would tend to qualify it, say he's a good scientist or he's a good geometer, just as we would say he's a good golfer or a good cameraman. But that doesn't lead to our saying, therefore he is a good man without qualification. What makes one to be a good person without qualification, that is in the full and absolute sense, is if one's will is oriented to the true good of the human being. And that is something that is assured to the degree that it can be assured in this life by habits which direct appetite to follow the guidance of reason, practical reason, as to the good for man. Okay, so from that point of view, this approach, insofar as we would think of the variety of virtues, we would tend to put moral virtues first. And we would tend to think that they are the kind of presupposition for our calling the other virtues part of the good life, so that the act, just as when we talked about the order of learning the philosophical sciences, remember moral virtue was the penultimate science that we were supposed to learn prior to theology. And when we talked about that, we said that one reason for its placement there is that the moral goodness would give us an affinity or would remove impediments to our attending to the divine, to knowledge of the divine. So it's as if there had to be a kind of existential preparation for this kind of knowledge. In this sense, to generalize, we would say it looks as if the moral virtues are kind of predispositions for the intellectual virtues. Well, that doesn't seem to be true if the kind of problem that I mentioned a moment ago is possible. That is, if someone can have intellectual virtues and not have moral virtues, it's pretty hard to say that the acquisition of the moral virtues is a presupposition to the acquisition of the intellectual virtues. But I think nonetheless we'd have to say that in some sense, some semblance of moral virtues are required for the acquisition of a science or for the acquisition of an artistic skill or an athletic skill. When you see the ascetic life to which athletes and musicians and scientists too, to an extent, subject themselves in order to achieve the skills in question, clearly this is curbing their appetites for all kinds of diversion and pleasant things other than the knowledge or skill that they're pursuing. So there seems to be some semblance of control of appetites and ordering of one's appetitive dispositions by reason in the acquisition of sciences, so or artistic skills. So we have there a kind of ambiguous answer to the question whether or not the moral virtues are required for the acquisition of the intellectual virtues. I think what Aristotle would say, and what Thomas would say in this regard is this, that while it is possible to acquire intellectual virtues without the moral virtues, they can only really be part of the good life if the knower also has acquired the moral virtues, which gives him the capacity to use that skill well, to use his art well, or to use his athletic capacity well, or to use his scientific knowledge well. Absent that kind of disposition that comes from the moral virtues, if the possession of science in some way fits into what we would call a good life, it would look to be more accidental than what we would naturally expect. Anyway, something like that, I suspect, would be what Aristotle would, on balance, say. He clearly doesn't want to say that you can't be a geometer, I don't care how much you claim to know, because you're a bad guy. You could clearly come to a lot of geometrical, mathematical knowledge without moral virtue. But it wouldn't be possessing that knowledge as an element in the good life if one did not have moral virtue. I think that's a somewhat satisfying resolution of the difficulty. But in any case, what we find in Aristotle when he makes an ordering of the virtues, when he makes a hierarchy of the virtues, he does not put moral virtue first. Notice how complicated and an interesting way this becomes. Rational activity in a secondary sense is the seat of virtue in the primary sense. And now Aristotle, when he talks about the ranking of the virtues, is going to put one of the intellectual virtues at the top, and it is contemplation. Aristotle ends his Nicomachean Ethics in the 10th book with an extended discussion of contemplation as the overall purpose of human life. I think here we can see the fusion of the intellectual and moral virtues in a way that I tried to suggest it a moment ago. It is as if the possession of the moral virtues is not really an end in itself. It's not really an end in itself, but it's to release us for this highest form of the specifically human function, the exercise of it in its highest form in contemplation of the divine. And Thomas Aquinas, as you will not be surprised to learn, finds that another and very congenial way in which you can see the complementarity between the philosophical ideal of human life that we find in Aristotle and the ideal, the goal of human life as it's been revealed to us in Christianity. Because how does he see man's ultimate happiness, perfect happiness, in terms of the contrast that we were talking about before? He sees it as the beatific vision, as union with God, as seeing even as we are seen. A vision that beatifies us, which fulfills all of our desires, bringing to mind that phrase of St. Augustine in the Confessions, that our hearts are restless, O Lord. You've made us for ourselves, I'll get it. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in Thee. So that this beatific vision, this union with God, this contemplation, this contemplative happiness is what we're made for, is what we're made for. And Thomas sees in the analysis of Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics a kind of adumbration of this truth that we know only by revelation, that is our destiny. We would never, of course, have known that apart from revelation, and apart from grace we could never achieve it. So once more, as I say, a complementarity rather than an opposition between philosophy and the faith.